The pen hovered over the divorce decree, the black ink glistening under the fluorescent lights of the conference room, reflecting a marriage that had died long before this paperwork. Julian watched his wife, Alara, check her reflection in her phone screen, a small, triumphant smirk playing on her lips that she thought he didn't see, a smile reserved for a future he wasn't part of. She thought she was walking away with half an empire, but she hadn't read the single devastating clause on page 42 that defined fidelity in brutal financial terms. If you are drawn to stories where the loudest betrayals happen in silence and the sweetest revenge is served cold, stay with me for this journey. The hors d'oeuvres were tasteless, the champagne was lukewarm, and the conversation was recycled. It was a standard Tuesday night for Julian Thorne. He stood near a marble pillar at the edge of the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel, nursing a tumbler of scotch he hadn't sipped in 20 minutes. His tuxedo fit him like armor, rigid and protective, a necessary constraint for a man who spent his life designing structures that defied wind and gravity. Across the room, his wife, Alara, was the gravitational center of the party. She was wearing emerald silk, a color that made her eyes look dangerous. She threw her head back, laughing at something a young man whispered in her ear. The young man was Nico. Julian felt a cold, familiar tightening in his chest. Nico was 26, a brooding painter Julian had discovered in a Brooklyn loft 3 years ago. Julian had funded his first exhibition, introduced him to the right critics, and even bought the first 3 canvases to seed the market. He had built the stage Nico was now standing on. He watched as Nico's hand drifted to the small of Alara's back. It wasn't a friendly pat, it was a claim. The fingers lingered, the thumb tracing a small, intimate circle against the silk. Alara didn't flinch. She leaned into it, her body softening against the contact in a way she hadn't softened for Julian in years. "She looks radiant tonight, doesn't she?" Julian didn't turn. He knew the voice, Marcus, his firm's legal counsel and his only real friend. "She does," Julian said, his voice flat. "Success suits her. The gallery numbers are up. You should be proud. You built that space for her." "I built the walls, Marcus. She filled them." Julian's eyes never left the pair. He saw the look Alara gave Nico, a heavy-lidded, hungry glance that lasted a fraction of a second too long to be platonic. It was a look of conspiracy, a look that said, "I know what you look like in the dark." The vibration in his pocket broke his trance. He pulled out his phone, a notification from his home security system. Movement detected. Master bedroom. 8:15 p.m. He frowned. They were both here. The staff had the night off. He opened the app, tapping into the live feed history. The timestamp was from 2 hours ago, just before they had left for the gala. The video buffered for a moment before resolving into clarity. On the screen, Alara was standing by the dresser, fastening her diamond earrings. In the mirror's reflection, behind her, Julian saw a figure leaning against the doorframe. It was Nico. He was in the bedroom, in their sanctuary. On the video, Alara turned to Nico and mouthed 3 words. There was no audio, but Julian didn't need it. He was an architect. He understood how things fit together. "Be patient, love." Julian locked the phone and slid it back into his pocket. The room suddenly felt airless, the crystal chandeliers too bright, the laughter of the socialites too shrill. The betrayal wasn't just physical, it was structural. They weren't just cheating, they were planning. Alara caught his eye from across the room. For a second, her mask slipped, a flash of guilt, or perhaps annoyance that he was still watching her. Then the smile returned, dazzling and practiced. She raised her champagne flute to him in a mock toast. Julian didn't raise his glass. He turned to Marcus. "I need to review the prenuptial agreement, Marcus." Marcus choked slightly on his drink. "Excuse me? Now? Julian, you've been married 10 years. Tomorrow morning, 8:00 a.m. And Marcus?" Julian finally looked at his friend, his eyes devoid of any warmth. "I want the unredacted version, specifically the clauses we added regarding asset forfeiture in the event of breach of contract." "Julian," Marcus lowered his voice, "what did you see?" "I saw the cracks in the foundation," Julian said, placing his untouched scotch on a passing waiter's tray. "And I think the building is about to come down." He walked out of the ballroom, leaving his wife to her laughter and her lover, stepping into the cool New York night where the only thing that mattered was gravity. What goes up must eventually fall. The morning sun hit the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, casting long, sharp shadows across the breakfast table. Julian sat with his iPad propped open, reviewing the structural schematics for the new Hudson Spire. He wasn't actually reading the blueprints. He was counting the seconds until Alara spoke. "I might be late tonight," Alara said, pouring almond milk into her coffee. She didn't look at him. She was focused on her phone, her thumb scrolling rhythmically. "The gallery is hosting a private viewing for the Basel collection. It's going to be chaos." Julian took a sip of his black coffee. It was bitter, matching the taste in the back of his throat. "Who is the featured artist?" he asked, his voice steady, devoid of any tremor. "Oh, a mix of emerging talents," she said vaguely, finally glancing up. Her eyes were clear, innocent. The practice behind that innocence was terrifying. "Nico has a few pieces up. I have to be there to support him. You know how anxious he gets with critics." "Of course," Julian said. "Give him my best." He watched her leave 20 minutes later. She kissed his cheek, a dry, perfunctory peck that smelled of expensive moisturizer and deceit. As the elevator doors slid shut, sealing her away, Julian didn't go to his office. He went to a nondescript gray sedan waiting 3 blocks away. Inside the car sat Arthur Vance, a man whose tailored suit cost more than most people's cars, yet who possessed the ability to disappear into a crowd. Vance was not a gritty detective from a noir film. He was a forensic accountant of human behavior, utilized only by the city's elite. "Mr. Thorne," Vance nodded, handing Julian a tablet. "The preliminary timeline." Julian took the device. His fingers felt cold. On the screen was a detailed log of the last 6 months. Hotel receipts from the St. Regis. Uber rides to an address in Soho that served as Nico's studio. Credit card charges for 2 dinners at Le Bernardin on nights Alara had claimed she was visiting her mother in Connecticut. "The emotional affair has likely been ongoing for a year," Vance said, his tone clinical, like a doctor diagnosing a terminal illness. "The physical aspect, at least 4 months. But Julian, for the clause to hold up in court, specifically the paragraph 14 moral turpitude addendum we discussed, we need more than receipts. We need the smoking gun. We need to prove undeniable cohabitation or sexual acts during the marriage." "Get it," Julian said. "I have a team installing micro cameras in the studio today while the artist is out preparing for his show," Vance said. "Are you sure you want to see the feeds? I can just summarize the findings." Julian looked out the tinted window. New York was waking up, people rushing to jobs, holding hands, living lives that felt light years away from his own. He remembered the day he met Alara, how she had looked at him as if he were the only structure in the world that wouldn't collapse. "I need to see it," Julian replied. "I need to know exactly what I'm paying for." He returned to his office at midday. His executive assistant, Sarah, greeted him with a stack of messages, but he waved her off, locking the heavy oak door. He sat at his desk, surrounded by models of skyscrapers, towers of glass and steel designed to withstand hurricanes and earthquakes. He felt a profound irony. He could engineer a building to survive a Category 5 storm, but he hadn't been able to reinforce his own marriage against the ego of a 26-year-old painter. His phone buzzed. A message from Alara. "Thinking of you. Miss you. Hope the meetings go well. XOXO. A minute later, a notification from Vance's secure app pinged on his private server. Subject, surveillance log 004. Location, Soho Studio. Time, 1:15 p.m. Julian opened the file. It was a photo taken from a long-range lens. Alara and Nico walking into the studio building. They weren't just walking. Nico had his hand in the back pocket of her jeans. Alara was laughing, her head thrown back, looking freer than she had ever looked in this office. Julian stared at the image until the pixels seemed to burn into his retina. He didn't delete the text from his wife. He didn't reply to it. He simply forwarded the photo to a hidden folder on his encrypted drive named the Exit Strategy. He picked up his pen and returned to the blueprints of the Hudson Spire. If the foundation was rotten, you didn't patch it. You let it crumble so you could build something stronger in its place. The penthouse was quiet, the kind of silence that usually precedes a structural failure. Julian returned home late, the hum of the city elevators fading into the stillness of the foyer. He found Ilara in the living room, seated on the beige Italian sofa, her legs tucked beneath her. A bottle of Pinot Noir was open on the coffee table, a single glass half empty in her hand. She wasn't on her phone tonight. She was staring at the unlit fireplace, her expression carefully composed into a mask of melancholic resolve. Julian recognized the posture. It was the same one she used when she had to fire a gallery assistant or cancel a charity pledge. It was the pose of a woman preparing to deliver bad news while framing herself as the victim. "We need to talk, Julian," she said, her voice soft, practiced. Julian loosened his tie, the silk slipping through his fingers like water. He walked to the bar cart and poured himself a water, skipping the scotch. He needed his mind razor sharp. "I'm listening," and he said, remaining standing. Ilara took a sip of wine, a fortification. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about us, about who we used to be, amigos." She paused, waiting for him to interrupt, to reassure her. When he didn't, she continued, a slight edge of irritation entering her tone. "We aren't partners anymore, Julian. We're just cohabitants in a glass tower. I feel like I'm suffocating. I've lost myself trying to be the wife you need for your galas and your board dinners." Julian watched her, his face impassive. Internally, he was marveling at the audacity. Lost herself? He had funded 3 gallery expansions in 5 years. He had introduced her to the board of the Met. The wife she was describing was a role she played only when the cameras were on. The rest of the time, she was Nico's muse. "I didn't realize you were so unhappy," Julian lied. The words tasted like ash. "I am," she sighed, a single perfect tear glistening in her eye. I think we need to separate. For both our sakes, I need to find my own path again." Here it was, the pivot. "And how do you envision this path, Ilara?" Julian asked, stepping closer. "Logistically." Ilara straightened her back. The sadness evaporated, replaced by the steeliness of a negotiator. "I've already spoken to a lawyer, just to understand my rights. Given the duration of our marriage and the contributions I've made to your brand's social standing, half is the starting point, Julian, plus alimony to maintain the standard of living I'm accustomed to." She said, "It's so casually." Half. Half of the firm he built from the ground up while she was sleeping until noon. Half of the legacy his grandfather started. And alimony to fund her life with a 26-year-old artist who couldn't pay his own rent. Julian looked at her hands. She was twisting her wedding ring, not out of nervousness, but as if it were a shackle she couldn't wait to pry off. "You want a divorce," Julian stated flatly. "I want freedom," she corrected, tilting her chin up. "But I don't want a war. My lawyer says if we settle quickly, we can keep this out of the press. You know how the board hates scandal. It would be better for you to just agree to the terms." It was a threat wrapped in concern. She was leveraging his reputation against his wallet. Julian walked to the window looking out at the city lights. He thought of the file on his encrypted drive, the photos of her and Nico entering the studio, the text messages, the timeline. He could destroy her right now. He could throw the photos on the coffee table and watch her face crumble. But anger was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not yet. He turned back to her, his shoulders slumping in feigned defeat. He let the exhaustion wash over his face. "I can't fight you, Ilara," he said quietly. "If you're this unhappy, then there's no point in dragging it out. Have your lawyer send the draft." Ilara blinked, surprised by the ease of his surrender. A small, victorious smile tugged at the corner of her mouth before she suppressed it. She thought he was broken. She thought he was weak. "Thank you, Julian," she whispered, standing up to walk past him toward the guest bedroom. "It's for the best." "Yes," Julian replied to the empty room once she was gone. "It certainly is." The conference room at Sterling and Vance smelled of lemon polish and intimidation. It was a neutral ground, located in a glass-walled skyscraper in Midtown, far enough from Julian's office to avoid prying eyes, but expensive enough to stroke Ilara's ego. Julian sat on one side of the mahogany table, flanked only by Marcus. On the other side sat Ilara and her attorney, a man named Sterling, who wore a suit that was slightly too shiny and a watch that was definitely too large. Sterling was known as a bulldog, the kind of lawyer hired not to negotiate but to sever arteries. "Let's cut to the chase, Mr. Thorne," Sterling began, sliding a thick document across the table. My client has become accustomed to a certain lifestyle. The role of a CEO's wife is a full-time job. The emotional labor alone— Skip the preamble, Julian interrupted, his voice weary. He rubbed his temples, feigning a migraine he didn't have. What is the number? Alara looked at him, surprised. She had expected a fight. She had expected him to list her failures, her spending, her lack of involvement in his actual work. Instead, he looked defeated. The titan of architecture looked like a structure whose load-bearing walls had finally given way. We want the Hamptons estate, Sterling said, emboldened by Julian's tone. Full title. We want the Tribeca loft for liquid assets and a lump sum of $12 million, plus, obviously, the monthly alimony capped at $50,000, adjusted for inflation, for the next 10 years. Marcus scoffed, leaning forward. That's nearly 40% of his liquid capital. That's absurd. The prenuptial agreement specifically stated. The prenuptial is 10 years old, Sterling countered smoothly, and it can be contested. Do you really want a discovery phase, Mr. Thorne? Do you want us to depose your staff, your assistants? We can drag this out for 2 years. Imagine what that does to your stock price. The rumors alone would kill the Hudson Spire merger. It was a bluff, but a well-researched one. They knew the Hudson Spire project was Julian's magnum opus. They were banking on his obsession with his legacy. Julian held up a hand, silencing Marcus. He looked at Alara. She wasn't meeting his eyes. She was inspecting her manicure, but he saw the tension in her jaw. She was terrified he would say no. She needed this money to fund the fantasy life she had promised Nico. Without Julian's money, Nico was just a starving artist, and Alara was just a middle-aged divorcee with expensive taste. If I agree, Julian said softly, will this end quickly? Alara looked up then. Julian, I can't deal with a circus, Alara, he said, injecting a note of desperation into his voice. The merger is next month. I need a clean break. No press, no leaks, no court dates. If you sign the term sheet, Sterling smiles, a predatory grin, we can have the final divorce decree ready in 48 hours, uncontested. Julian looked down at the table, tracing the grain of the wood with his finger. He let the silence stretch, letting them think he was weighing the agony of the loss. In reality, he was calculating the victory. By agreeing to their financial demands, he was making the monetary clauses the focus, distracting them from the behavioral clauses that were already embedded in the framework of the agreement. Give her what she wants, Julian murmured to Marcus, loud enough for them to hear. Julian, are you sure? Marcus asked, playing his part perfectly. This is— Just do it, Julian snapped, standing up abruptly. Draft it. I'll sign whatever you put in front of me. Just get me out of this marriage. He didn't look at Alara as he walked out. If he had, he might have seen the flash of triumph in her eyes, the look of a gambler who thinks the house has finally lost. She didn't realize that in Julian's world, the house was the only thing that was engineered to never fall. It was 2 a.m. The city outside Julian's office window was a grid of amber and obsidian, a sprawling circuit board of energy and darkness. Inside, the only light came from the banker's lamp on Marcus's desk, illuminating a stack of papers 3 inches thick. It's a gamble, Julian saw, Marcus said, rubbing his eyes. He looked aged by the hour, his tie undone, the top button of his shirt unfastened. Sterling is a shark. If he smells blood in the water, he won't just ask her more money. He'll tear this document apart clause by clause. Julian stood by the window, his reflection ghostly against the glass. He's not looking for blood. Marcus. He's looking for the payout. He's focused on the lump sum because that's where his commission comes from. He's looking at the $12 million, not the footnotes. Julian turned and walked back to the desk. He tapped a specific paragraph on page 42, section 14, subsection C, the conditional asset allocation. The language was dense, a thicket of legalese designed to bore the reader into submission. It stated that the agreed-upon alimony and asset transfer were contingent upon the affirmation that neither party has engaged in conduct violating the marital fidelity clause of the original 2014 prenuptial agreement prior to the execution of this separation decree. It looks standard, Marcus admitted, peering at the text. It looks like boilerplate language about not disparaging the company or causing public scandal. Exactly, Julian said. Sterling thinks this is about protecting my public image. He thinks I'm afraid Alara will go to the tabloids, so he'll see this as me buying her silence. He won't realize it's actually a trapdoor. The phone on the desk buzzed. It was an email from Sterling's office, a red-line version of the draft. Marcus's hand hovered over the mouse. This is it. If he struck Section 14, we're dead. Open it, Julian commanded. Marcus clicked the file. The document loaded on the large monitor on the wall. They scanned through the changes. Sterling had been busy. He had increased the inflation adjustment cap. He had demanded that Julian cover Alara's legal fees. He had even added a clause allowing Alara to keep the leased Range Rover. Greed. Pure, unadulterated greed. They scrolled down to page 42. The text was there, unchanged, unmarked. Sterling had been so busy fighting for the car and the legal fees that he had glossed over the condition of the main payout. He assumed his client was innocent. He assumed Alara had been honest with him. It was the fatal flaw of arrogance, believing that because you are winning the battle, you have already won the war. He missed it, Marcus breathed, slumping back in his chair in disbelief. He actually missed it. He didn't miss it, Julian corrected, his voice cold. He underestimated the structural integrity of the agreement. He thinks he is robbing a bank, unaware that the die packs are already in the bag. Julian picked up his phone. He opened the Surveillance app one last time. The feed showed Nico's studio. The lights were off, but the timestamp showed activity until late. Alara was likely there now, celebrating the negotiation, drinking champagne paid for with Julian's credit card, toasting to a future funded by Julian's labor. She had no idea that the pen she would use tomorrow wasn't a writing instrument. It was a detonator. Print it, Julian said to Marcus. Final copy on archival paper. I want the ink to be permanent. Marcus hit the command. The laser printer in the corner began to hum, a rhythmic, mechanical sound that filled the silent office. Whir-sh, whir-sh. It sounded like a blade being sharpened. Julian walked back to the window. The dawn was beginning to break over the East River, a bruised purple bleeding into the gray. The waiting was over. The design was complete. Now all that was left was for the tenant to walk into the building and close the door behind her. The penthouse felt like a museum exhibit of a life that no longer existed. Cardboard boxes were stacked neatly in the hallway, labeled in Alara's looping, elegant handwriting. Summer clothes, books, personal archives. The physical dismantling of 10 years of marriage had been reduced to cardboard and packing tape. They sat at the long dining table for the last time. The personal chef had left a roasted branzino and a salad of bitter greens, then dismissed himself early, sensing the suffocating tension in the air. The only sound was the scrape of silver against porcelain and the low hum of the wine fridge. Alara was in high spirits. It was a manic, breathless kind of energy that grated on Julian's nerves. She poured herself a second glass of white wine, her movements fluid and loose. She looked like a woman who had just dropped a heavy backpack after a long hike. I think this is the right thing, Julian, she said, breaking the silence. I really do. We're going to be so much happier. Both of us. Julian cut a piece of fish with surgical precision. Happiness is a subjective metric, Alara. Oh, don't be so gloomy, she chided gently, reaching across the table to touch his hand. He didn't pull away, but his hand remained as cold as marble under hers. You'll find someone who gets you, someone who loves architecture as much as you do. And I'll finally have time to focus on the gallery, to really curate. She wasn't talking about curating art. She was talking about curating a life with Nico. Julian knew that with the $12 million she expected to receive tomorrow, she planned to buy a brownstone in the West Village. Vance's team had already flagged the inquiries she'd made to real estate agents under her maiden name. Will you stay in the city? Julian asked, knowing the answer. I think so, she said, her eyes drifting to her phone, which lay face up on the table. The screen lit up with a text notification. N, just a single initial. I might travel for a bit first, Italy maybe, get some inspiration. Julian took a sip of water. He remembered their honeymoon in Italy, Lake Como. The way she had looked at him on the boat, swearing that he was the only man she would ever need. That woman was Dead. The stranger sitting across from him was merely wearing her face. And the money, Julian asked softly, is the settlement satisfactory? Alara suppressed a smile, trying to look solemn. It's fair, Julian. It's enough to ensure I'm secure. That's all I ever wanted. Security. Security. The word hung in the air, heavy with irony. She was defining security as a bank balance provided by the man she was betraying. She had no concept that true security came from loyalty, from the structural integrity of a promise kept. I'm glad, Julian said. I wouldn't want you to worry about your future. You're a good man, Julian, she said, and for a fleeting second, she almost seemed to mean it. I know I hurt you, but we've just evolved in different directions. We can still be friends, can't we? I'd hate to lose your friendship. It was the ultimate insult, the consolation prize of the adulterer. Let's be friends so I don't have to feel guilty about what I did. We'll see, Julian replied, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. He placed it on the table, folding it once, twice, ensuring the edges aligned perfectly. He stood up. I'm going to turn in. We have an early start at the lawyer's office tomorrow. Alara nodded, picking up her phone immediately. Good night, Julian. Sleep well. As Julian walked down the long hallway toward the guest room he had been sleeping in for the past week, he heard the faint whoosh of a sent message from the dining room. She was telling Nico it was almost over. She was telling him they had won. Julian closed the door to his room and did not turn on the light. He stood in the darkness, listening to the silence of the apartment. He didn't feel sadness anymore. The grief had hardened into something cold and sharp, like the steel beams of the skyscrapers he built. Tomorrow the demolition would begin, and unlike his buildings, this controlled implosion would leave nothing behind but dust. The conference room was airless, sealed off from the noise of Manhattan by 3 inches of soundproof glass. The long mahogany table was a battlefield of paperwork, organized into neat stacks by the paralegals. Alara sat next to Sterling, her posture erect, radiating the confidence of a woman who had already spent the money in her head. She wore a white suit, a choice Julian found particularly galling. It suggested purity, a fresh start. Standard procedure, Sterling droned, flipping to the signature page of the heavy settlement binder. Signatures on the last page, initials on the bottom right of every preceding page. Once executed, the wire transfer for the lump sum will be initiated within 48 hours. Alara picked up the heavy Mont Blanc pen provided by the firm. She looked at Julian across the table. He sat still, his hands folded on top of a manila envelope that no one had asked about yet. His face was unreadable, a mask of stone. Are you ready, Julian? She asked, her voice soft, carrying a hint of faux sympathy. I am, Julian replied. The sound of the pen scratching against the paper was the only noise in the room. Scritch, scratch. It was the sound of a life being dismantled. Alara signed with a flourish, her loops wide and decorative. She initialed the pages rapidly, barely glancing at the text. She trusted her lawyer. She trusted Julian's defeat. When she finished, she slid the binder across the table. Julian took the pen. He didn't rush. He signed his name with the precise block lettering of a draftsman. Julian Thorne. He initialed the pages. Every mark was a lock clicking into place. He closed the binder and placed his hands flat on the leather cover. Done, Sterling announced, clapping his hands together with a used car salesman grin. Congratulations to you both on a civilized resolution. We will send over the wiring instructions for the $12 million. Alara exhaled, a smile breaking across her face. She reached for her handbag, ready to leave, ready to call Nico, ready to start her life. There will be no transfer, Julian said. The room froze. It wasn't a shout, it was a statement of fact, delivered with the casual indifference of a weather report. Sterling chuckled nervously. Excuse me, the agreement is signed, Mr. Thorne. It's binding. Section 4 outlines the payment schedule clearly. In Section 14, subsection C outlines the conditions of that payment, Marcus interjected, his voice sharp. He didn't smile. He simply pointed to the document. Specifically the clause regarding the conditional asset allocation based on marital fidelity prior to the execution of the decree. Alara's smile faltered. What are you talking about? Julian didn't speak to her. He slid the manila envelope across the table. It stopped directly in front of Sterling. "Open it," Julian commanded. Sterling opened the envelope. He pulled out the photographs. The first one was grainy but clear. Alara and Nico kissing in the doorway of the Soho studio. The second was a high-resolution shot of them at a hotel bar in Chelsea, his hand clearly under her skirt. The third was a log of text messages, explicitly detailing dates, times, and acts that left no room for interpretation. Sterling's face went pale. He looked from the photos to the contract he had just allowed his client to sign. He flipped frantically to page 42. He read the paragraph he had skimmed the night before. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. This is inadmissible," Sterling stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's perfectly admissible," Marcus countered, "and it constitutes a material breach of the morality clause in the original prenup, which this settlement explicitly upholds as a condition for the alimony and lump sum waiver. By signing this document today, Alara affirmed she had not breached the contract. These photos prove she lied." Alara snatched the photos from Sterling's bond. Her eyes widened. The color drained from her face, leaving her white suit looking gray against her skin. She stared at the image of herself and Nico, the secret she thought was so safe, now lying on a mahogany table under fluorescent lights. "You knew," she whispered, looking up at Julian. Her voice trembled. "You knew the whole time." "I knew," Julian said, finally standing up. He buttoned his jacket. "I watched you play the victim for weeks, Alara. I watched you demand half of my life while you were giving yours to someone else." "You can't do this," she said, her voice rising to a shrill panic. "We signed. You agreed to the 12 million. "I agreed to pay it if you had remained faithful," Julian corrected cold. "You signed the paper confirming you were. You defrauded the agreement the moment the ink touched the page. The penalty for that fraud is total forfeiture." He looked at Sterling, who was now sweating profusely, realizing he had just cost his client a fortune and likely a malpractice suit. "You get nothing, Alara," Julian said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a scream. "No townhouse, no alimony, no lump sum. You leave this marriage with exactly what you brought into it, which, if I recall correctly, is nothing." He turned and walked toward the door. "Julian!" she screamed, scrambling up from her chair, the photos scattering onto the floor like fallen leaves. "Julian, please! You can't leave me with nothing." Julian paused at the door, his hand on the brass handle. He didn't turn back. "Ask Nico to pay the rent," he said. Then he opened the door and walked out, leaving the chaos behind him, sealed behind the soundproof glass. The sidewalk outside the office building was gray and indifferent. Alara stood by the curb, the wind whipping strands of hair across her face, ruining the blowout she had gotten specifically for her victory lap. She clutched her phone like a lifeline, her knuckles white. She had called Nico 3 times. He had answered on the 4th, his voice thick with sleep and irritation. "I don't understand," Nico said, the static of the line cutting through the city noise. "What do you mean 0? That's impossible. You said it was a done deal. You said we were looking at 12 million. "He knew, Nico," Alara whispered, shielding the microphone from the roar of a passing bus. "He had photos of everything, the studio, the hotel. The clause in the prenup voided the settlement. I have nothing. I might even owe legal fees." There was a silence on the other end of the line. It wasn't the silence of a partner processing a shared tragedy. It was the silence of a parasite realizing the host had died. "Nico," she asked, her voice trembling, "I'm coming over. I just need to get out of here. We can figure this out. I can sell my jewelry. We can sublet a smaller place." "Alara," Nico's voice was different now. Cold, distant. It sounded like the voice of a stranger. "I have a deadline for the gallery show next month. I can't deal with this kind of drama right now. I need space to create." "Space?" She felt the ground tilt beneath her heels. "I left my husband for you. I walked away with nothing for you." "You didn't leave him for me," Nico corrected, his tone sharp. "You left him for a fantasy. And frankly, Alara, without the funding, the fantasy doesn't work. I can't support you. I'm an artist." "Nico," the line went dead. No goodbye, no apology, just the digital void. Alara stared at the phone screen. The background was still a photo of her and Nico laughing in the Hamptons. It looked like a picture from another lifetime. She lowered the phone, looking at the reflection of herself in the glass facade of the office building. She looked older. She looked small. The city, which had always felt like her playground, suddenly looked like a fortress she had been locked out of. She raised her hand to hail a taxi, then realized she didn't know where to tell the driver to go. 40 stories above the chaos, Julian stood on the unfinished terrace of the Hudson Spire. The wind here was fierce, tugging at his coat, but he didn't flinch. The safety railing hadn't been installed yet, just the raw steel beams jutting out into the abyss. He walked to the edge, his leather shoes finding purchase on the concrete. Below him, Manhattan was a grid of lights, a sprawling machine of ambition and heartbreak. Somewhere down there in the maze of avenues, Alara was learning the physics of the real world. She was learning that actions have equal and opposite reactions. Mr. Thorne? He turned. Marcus stood in the doorway of the construction elevator, holding a hard hat. We received the confirmation from Sterling's office, Marcus said, his voice echoing in the open space. They aren't contesting. Sterling is terrified of a malpractice suit. He advised her to walk away before we countersue for the cost of the investigation. Good, Julian said. He didn't feel a surge of triumph. He felt a quiet, hollow clarity. What do you want to do about the apartment? Marcus asked. Sell it, Julian replied, looking back out at the skyline. Sell it all. The furniture, the art, the memories. I don't want to live in a renovation. I want to build something new. He looked at the skeletal structure of the spire around him. It was just steel and concrete right now, cold and uninviting. But it was honest. It had nothing to hide. It would take time to finish, months of labor, millions of dollars, and sleepless nights. But when it was done, it would be his. No clauses, no conditions, no lies. Julian took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs. It was sharp and biting, but it was clean. He buttoned his coat, turned his back on the city view, and walked toward the elevator. The demolition was over. It was time to pour the foundation.